الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والحمد لله الذي هدانا لهذا وما كنا لنهتدي لولا أن هدانا الله والصلاة والسلام على إمام القبلتين ونبي الحرمين وأفضل الثقلين وجد الحسن والحسين الذي سمي في السماء بأحمد وفي الأرض بأبي القاسم محمد وعلى أهل بيته الطيبين الطاهرين المعصومين الصادقين والذين ذهب الله عنهم الرجس وطهرهم تطهيرا اللهم صل وسلم وزد وبارك على صاحب الدعوة النبوية والصولة الحيدرية والإسمة الفاطمية والحلم الحسنية والشجاعة الحسينية والعبادة السجادية والمعاطر الباقرية والآثار الجعفرية والعلوم الكاذمية والحجج الردبية والجود الثقفية والنقاوة النقبية والحيبة العسكرية والغيبة الإلهية اللهم عجل فرجه وسهل مخرجه أما بعد فقد قال الله في كتابه الكريم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم تلك الدار الآخرة نجعلها للذين لا يريدون علوا في الأرض ولا فسادا والعاقبة للمتقين صدق الله العلي العظيم. For the love of Ahlul Bayt alayhim as-salam, sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the love of Fatima al-Zahra in particular, a second salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. For the hastening of the reappearance of the master of our time, a louder salawat ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. The hadith of Unwan al-Basri is one of the most famous traditions of the holy sixth Imam. When you look at this tradition, you find that the popularity of this tradition is one which is quite extensive, especially amongst the circles of the Urafa and the mystics, and widely amongst the circle of the religious students. You find, for example, an individual like Ayatollah Qadi Tabatabai, when he would advise his students, he would say to them that at least once or twice a week, look over and reflect over the contents within this tradition. Or you find that another anecdote he would tell individuals who would want to be his students, that do not come to me until you practice upon the teachings found within the hadith of Unwan al-Basri. You see, within this month of Shahr Ramadan, where one seeks to build a relationship with Allah and to walk upon the path of ubudiyah and servitude, one really needs to ask themselves that, number one, what is servitude? And number two, how does one practically engage within this act of servitude? And when these two questions, they come to the forefront, you find that this hadith of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is one, Sallu ala Muhammad wa ali Muhammad. We find that this tradition of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq is one which contains a great amount of advice about how an individual attains the state of ubudiyah and attains the state of servitude. Because when you examine the different topics found within this narration, for example, the Imam explains that what is the true nature of ilm and knowledge. The Imam explains that what role does guidance have within the life of a human being. The Imam explains that how can a person become one of self-discipline? How does a person interact with those around them? And how does one build a relationship with Allah? And indeed, tonight we'll examine this tradition in order that we can understand that what is ubudiyah and servitude. You see, the first point to note that when it comes to this tradition of Unwan al-Basri, Unwan al-Basri was a 94-year-old individual. But despite being a 94-year-old individual, he had a desire for knowledge and he would go to Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. Shaykh al-Bahai, in his famous work known as the Kashkul, would narrate from al-Shaheed al-Awwal, who would narrate this tradition from whom? From Unwan al-Basri. Unwan al-Basri would say that one day when I was in Medina, I heard that Ja'far al-Sadiq salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi had come towards Medina. Unwan al-Basri says, when I've heard that Ja'far al-Sadiq came to Medina, I would love to take from his knowledge in the way that I would go to Malik bin Anas, because Unwan al-Basri at that time in Medina, he would go towards the classes of Malik bin Anas and he would benefit from the classes of Malik bin Anas. Now he says that when Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq comes to Medina, فَأَحْبَبْتُ أَنْ آخُذَ عَنْهُ كَمَا أَخَذْتُ عَنْ مَالِكٍ. That in the way that I would take from Malik, I would like to take from Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. But he says that when I went towards the door of Ja'far al-Sadiq, and he said to him that I want to take from your knowledge, Imam al-Sadiq replies to Unwan al-Basri with something from the outward may look strange to us. That imagine a 94-year-old individual is going to the Imam. You know what the Imam says to that man? The Imam says, Inni rajulun matloob, that I am a busy individual. وَمَعَ ذَلِكَ لِي أَوْرَادٌ فِي كُلِّ سَاعَاتٍ مِنْ آنَاءِ اللَّيْلِ وَالنَّهَارِ. On top of that, I have different recitations which I recite throughout the hours of the day and the night. Go towards Malik and take from Malik as you normally do. Don't come towards me. You find this individual, Unwan al-Basri, he becomes disheartened after this. He says, after that, I began to say to myself that if there was any goodness within me, then Ja'far al-Sadiq would have seen that goodness. After that day, I stopped going to the classes of Malik bin Anas. And I would stay within my home, and the only time I would leave my home is to recite the prayer within the mosque of the Prophet. Until a day had come that I had become tired of this state. So I went to the mosque of Rasulullah and I recited 2 units of prayer. And after reciting those 2 units of prayer, I prayed to Allah, As'aluka ya Allah, أن تعطف علي قلب جعفر وترزقني من علمه ما أهتدى به إلى صراطك المستقيم. I made this dua, O Allah, allow the heart of Ja'far al-Sadiq to become soft towards me and allow me to take from his knowledge that which will guide me to the straight path. He says, after I made this dua, I went towards the house of Ja'far al-Sadiq, and when I went towards his house, the servant comes out, and the servant says to me that, what do you want? I say, Assalamu ala Sharif, that I want to give my salam to the honorable one, meaning Imam al-Sadiq. The servant says, wait at this moment. When the servant tells him to wait, the servant returns after some time, and he says that Imam al-Sadiq has allowed you to enter, and he says, Udkhul ala barakatillah, enter upon the blessings of Allah. And then after that, he begins to engage in his dialogue with Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. You see, from this first portion of the hadith, there are a number of lessons that we gain by the actions of this individual. The first lesson that we gain is the importance of seeking knowledge. Unwan al-Basri is an individual who was 94 years old. On top of that, in the works of hadith, we have no other mention of Unwan al-Basri except for this hadith. In other words, 1400 years later, we are taking the name of this man. Why? That even at such an elderly age, he was an individual who would seek knowledge with what? With sincerity. That's why the famous tradition of Rasulullah said, "Utlubul ilma min al-mahdi ila al-lahad," that an individual should seek knowledge from what? From the cradle towards the grave. So you find that this was the first lesson over here. But the second lesson in this situation is something which Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq carried out. Because you would imagine that when a 94-year-old man comes, the Imam would be willing to help such an individual, as in if there was an elderly individual in this community, and that elderly individual asked you for help, what would be your first reaction? Your first reaction would be to help such an individual. But what did Imam al-Sadiq do? Imam al-Sadiq turned that man away from his doorstep. But in reality, you find there was a wisdom behind the action of the Imam. That from the first level, the Imam was testing the sincerity of this individual. In the way when Rasulullah's grandson Imam al-Hussein was going towards Karbala, and Hur stops the army of the Imam, and the Imam says, "May your mother weep over you." And Hur replies by saying that if your mother was anyone other than Fatimatul Zahra, I would say the same line towards you. The goal of Sayyid al-Shuhada wasn't to insult Hur. In the same way, Imam al-Sadiq is not insulting Unwan al-Basri, but he's giving that lesson that oftentimes if you want to acquire a certain type of knowledge, that knowledge requires sincerity, it requires a spiritual preparation. So you find this was that first lesson. But the second lesson that Imam al-Sadiq wanted to teach towards this individual is that this individual said that I want to take from Ja'far al-Sadiq in the same way that I would take from Malik bin Anas. That who was Malik bin Anas? Malik bin Anas was the student of Abu Hanifa, and he was the teacher of Ash-Shafi'i, who was the teacher of Ahmad bin Hanbal. And Imam al-Sadiq would be the teacher of Abu Hanifa, and Abu Hanifa would say, "Lola sanatan halak al-Nu'man." That if it wasn't for my 2 years with Ja'far al-Sadiq, then I would have been destroyed. But you find over here, Imam al-Sadiq is saying that if you want to acquire knowledge in its finest sense, then this statement that I want to take from Ahlul Bayt in the way that I take from others, that statement shouldn't be there. In other words, yes, one can go to other sources for knowledge, but there is only one source of knowledge which is a hujjah upon you, and that is that ilm which comes from the door of Ahlul Bayt. That's why Imam Muhammad al-Baqir would say in a tradition that sharrika wa gharriba, that go towards the east, go towards the west. Lan tajida ilman sahihan illa indana Ahlul Bayt. That you will not find true knowledge except it's at the door of us, Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. So you find Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq in this tradition, he begins to spiritually prepare this individual. But the third lesson that we take from this introductory portion of the hadith is that when the servant tells Unwan al-Basri to enter into the house, the servant uses the line udkhul ala barakatillah. In other words, Unwan al-Basri, he goes to the mosque of Rasulullah, he makes that dua that, "Oh Allah, make the heart of Ja'far al-Sadiq soft towards me," and the outcome of this dua is the servant says udkhul ala barakatillah, in the blessings of Allah. In other words, the lesson that we take over here is that if we want blessing to come within our life in its fullest capacity, then at the first level, we need to make dua that we have a position within the heart of the Imam of our time. That when one is able to make that dua, then you find then and truly then they enter upon the blessing of Allah. So you find that over here, this was the first portion of the hadith of Unwan al-Basri. But when we approach the second portion of this tradition, over here, the Imam begins to speak to Unwan al-Basri, and he begins to explain towards him that what is the reality of ubudiyah and servitude. When Unwan al-Basri enters the room with Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, salawatullahi wa salamuhu alayhi, Imam al-Sadiq, the first thing he says to Unwan, that ma kunyatuk, that what is your title? Unwan al-Basri says, my title is Abu Abdullah. In other words, in the literal sense, my name is the father of the servants of Allah. This is my title. Imam al-Sadiq says to him, Tabbatallahu kunyatak, may you be established within this title. In other words, may you give justice to such a title that your parents have given you. Unwan al-Basri says that, O individual, O grandson of Rasulullah, I have come to take from your knowledge. Imam al-Sadiq repeats the line, he says, what do you want? He says, I want from your knowledge. After that, the Imam says, O Unwan, Ya Aba Abdullah, laysa al-ilmu bit-ta'allum. إنما هو نور يقع في قلب من يريد الله تبارك وتعالى أن يهديه فإن أردت العلم فاطلب أولا في نفسك حقيقة العبودية. You know what the Imam says? The Imam says knowledge isn't found in learning. Knowledge is a light which Allah places in the hearts of those whom He wants to guide. And if you want knowledge, the first thing you should seek within yourself is the reality of servitude. Over here in this portion of the tradition, there are a number of questions that we need to ask and that need to be answered. The first thing the Imam says is that knowledge isn't gained by learning. If knowledge isn't gained by learning, then what is the point of these lectures and what is the point of a classroom? What is the point of having a hawza and a seminary and different scholars giving information and knowledge when the Imam is saying knowledge isn't gained by learning, but rather it is a light and a nur placed in the hearts of the people? You see, over here, there are two different answers that can be given to this reply by the Imam. The first explanation is this, is that when you have a cause, either you have a complete cause or you have an incomplete cause. In other words, when you have a complete cause, the effect will always come from the cause. In other words, when you have the sun, it is necessary the rays of the sun will be there. You cannot separate the sun from the rays of the sun because it's a complete cause. But oftentimes, there are many different causes that when we carry them out, the effect doesn't necessarily come. And that is the reality of knowledge. Oftentimes, a person strives to gain knowledge, but they're not able to remember. Or they gain incorrect knowledge, or they're not able to reach the true nature of a reality. That's why Imam al-Sadiq is alluding that ilm, it requires tawfiq, ilm requires grace from Allah. But at the second level, when the Imam says that knowledge is not gained by learning, he is referring to a deeper type of knowledge. You see, there is one type of knowledge that is gained through reading and learning and listening. But there's another type of knowledge which God places within the heart. And I'll give you an example. If I explain to you what fear is, and I say fear is when your heart rate begins to go up and you feel that you're in such a state, you will say to me, that is very different than fearing fear yourself, feeling fear. For somebody to explain fear is something else. But for you to feel fear is something else. That's why there is a knowledge which is gained through concepts, but then there is a knowledge which Allah gives into the soul of an individual. And that is that type of knowledge. Imam al-Sadiq says that knowledge is a nur and a light for an individual. You see, light, its quality is that it gives a light towards others. It takes away darkness. But this knowledge allows you to know the path of right and wrong. And so you find that is that knowledge which is placed within the hearts of mankind. And Imam al-Sadiq says that if you want this knowledge, then you have to understand what is ubudiyah and what is servitude. So you find after this portion of the hadith, this individual says to the Imam that, okay, you told me, I'm paraphrasing in my own words, you said that one, if they want to acquire this knowledge, they have to understand the reality of servitude. So he says to the Imam that what is the reality of servitude? The Imam says there are three qualities of an abd and a servant. The first quality of an abd and a servant is that a servant does not view himself as possessing anything. Whatever is his possession, he views it as the ownership of Allah. The second quality of a servant is that they don't plan their affairs for themselves. And the third quality of a servant is that they preoccupy and they busy all of their time in what Allah has made halal, and they stay away from what Allah has prohibited. The Imam is saying that these are the three qualities of a servant. But when Ahlul Bayt would speak, there would be a way when they speak. The Imam says, if you're able to do these three things, then there will be three outcomes that come in your life. When you are able to view all of your possession as the possession of Allah and not yours, then at that moment, giving in the way of Allah will become easy for you. You see, when you look at the Quran, and when the Quran, it speaks about charity, there's a very interesting way when the Quran speaks about charity. For example, the Quran will say, "Mimma razaqnahum yunfiqun," that the believers are those individuals, what we have given them. Before the Quran says give towards others, Allah reminds mankind, "Mimma razaqnahum," that we are the ones who give towards you. And when we give towards you, then you find an individual, he gives towards others. That when you look at the life of Ahlul Bayt alayhimus salam, we find that the example of giving is something which is common amongst all members of Ahlul Bayt. You know, within this month of Shahr Ramadan, we remember Imam al-Hasan alayhi salam. It's stated in the works of history that twice in the life of Imam al-Hasan, he gave away every single possession that he had. That imagine having whatever that you have and you give away all to the amount of zero. Imam al-Hasan gave everything that he had. And it's stated that when Muawiyah hears of this generosity of Imam al-Hasan, Muawiyah sends a letter to Imam al-Hasan and he says, "La khayra fil israf." That, "Oh Hassan, I've heard that you gave away all of your possessions. This is something which is israf and extravagance, and there is no good in extravagance." You know what Imam al-Hasan replies? Imam al-Hasan sends the letter back and he says, "Ya Muawiyah, la israfa fil khair," that there is no extravagance when it comes to doing good. In other words, when it comes to giving others, there is no extravagance within that when you're doing something in the way of Allah. So you find that Imam al-Sadiq says the first sign of a servant is that whatever they have, they view it as the possession of Allah. And when you view it as the possession of Allah, then it becomes easy to give towards others because it wasn't yours to begin with. Then the Imam says, the second outcome of these three acts in the life of an individual is that when you understand that there is somebody else who is planning and managing your affairs, then the masaib and the difficulties of this world become easy upon you. That oftentimes in our lives, we try to carry out actions, but we're not able to reach that result. And oftentimes it agonizes us, it causes us difficulty. But Ahlul Bayt time and time remind us that there is always an element of life which is outside of our control. And instead of that being a source of agony, you find that needs to be a source of trusting Allah. As in, there's a famous tradition when they said to Amir al-Mu'mineen Ali ibn Abi Talib alayhi salam, they said to Ali that, how did you recognize Allah? The Imam doesn't give any philosophical argument or anything complex. But the Imam says that oftentimes there were intentions that I wanted to carry out in my life and I wasn't able to carry them out. Thus, at that moment, I recognized there was somebody who was managing my affair. So you find it is that mindset and that worldview of Ahlul Bayt, that although they went through the same events oftentimes we go through, our mindset takes us towards agony, but their mindset would take them closer towards Allah. So you find this was the second outcome. When one recognizes there is somebody else managing their affair, then they understand that the difficulties of this world are bearable. The third thing Imam al-Sadiq says is that when a servant of Allah, if he is a true servant, he occupies himself in what Allah has made halal and staying away from what God has prohibited. When a person is able to do this within their lives, then they won't have time for useless arguments with individuals, nor will they have time to boast. And when all three of these qualities they come, then the status of the world, the desire of wealth, and the desire of having a large position, all of this will begin to be small. And Imam al-Sadiq, he recites the verse of the Quran, تِلْكَ الدَّارُ الْآخِرَةُ نَجْعَلُهَا لِلَّذِينَ لَا يُرِيدُونَ عُلُوًّا فِي الْأَرْضِ وَلَا فَسَادًا. That the abode of the hereafter is not for those individuals who want to cause corruption or seek elevation within their life. Now over here, after this portion of the tradition, Unwan al-Basri says to Imam al-Sadiq that give me more advice. That you said that if you want knowledge, one needs to be a servant of Allah. Give me more advice on what it means to be a servant of Allah. And over here, Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq, he gives 9 pieces of advice. He says 3 of those pieces of advice are for riyadatun nafs and self-discipline. 3 of these pieces of advice are for hilm and forbearance and dealing with the society around you. And 3 of these pieces of advice are for your relationship with Allah. When it came to the first 3 pieces of advice, which are about self-discipline, the interesting thing about this advice is that the Imam gives 3 pieces of advice and all of them have to do with the diet of an individual. The Imam says, my first piece of advice is that do not eat when you don't have an appetite. For if you eat without an appetite, it takes you towards foolishness. You know, oftentimes in Shahr Ramadan, people, they ask the question, that why is it that I don't feel spirituality within this month? One of the reasons people, they feel sluggish is they fast all day, but the moment the iftar it comes, they try to fit 3 meals within 1 meal. When you go beyond your capacity in that moment, you find that naturally you're going to be sluggish. The Imam says, this is my first piece of advice for discipline. Because discipline, it begins in the way that you are able to control your stomach. And that is something which we see in the seerah of all of Ahlul Bayt. For example, we have a hadith that Imam Ali ibn Musa Rida would not eat from a dastarkhan. He wouldn't eat from a gathering unless there was a green vegetable at that gathering. So you find that discipline was there in the life of Ahlul Bayt. The second piece of advice Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq he gives is that if you are to eat and you do have an appetite, then make sure what you are eating is halal. You remember the name of Allah over it and you thank Allah for that blessing. And my third piece of advice is that whenever you eat, remember the hadith of Rasulullah, that there is no vessel worse that man fills than his stomach. And if you are to eat, then 1/3 for food, 1/3 for water, and 1/3 for air. You see, many people, they ask the question that within this world, modern world, how does one control their desire and temptations? One of the things that we find within the hadith of Ahlul Bayt is to control your diet. An individual who is able to fast, it's something which is very profound. Because food and drink is not something which is extra in our life. Food and drink is something which we need to survive. Allah is showing within this month of Shahr Ramadan, O human being, if you have such self-control that you're able to stay away from a necessity for life, then these things which are extra in life, you also have that self-control to stay away from that as well. And you find this is something which is a very profound lesson from Shahr Ramadan. So you find these were the 3 pieces of advice in relation to self-discipline. Then the Imam says that if you want to be a servant of Allah, there are 3 pieces of advice in terms of hilm and forbearance and how you interact with those around you. The Imam says the first piece of advice is that if someone says to you that if you say 1 insulting thing to me, I will say 10 insulting things towards you. If somebody says that, you reply to them by saying that even if you insult me 10 times, you will not hear a single thing from me. You see, Ahlul Bayt within their lives, they manifested this. For example, there's a very profound tradition of Imam Zainul Abidin. When they said to Imam Zainul Abidin that, "Oh Imam Zainul Abidin, how important is it for you to return an amana and a trust?" Imam Zainul Abidin would say that even if Shimar had given me that sword which he used against my father as an amana, I would not take it wrongly. I would return it. So you find this is that level of Ahlul Bayt. Imam al-Sadiq says the akhlaq of a believer is that even if somebody insults you 10 times, you say to them, I won't insult you in return. Then after that, the Imam, he says, if somebody slanders you, they speak ill about you, then say to that person that if what you say is true, then may Allah forgive me. And if what you say is a lie, then may Allah forgive you. And then the Imam says that if somebody promises you obscenity and foul words, in return you promise them kindness and generosity. So you find these were the 3 pieces of advice which relate to society and forbearance. But then the Imam says that within the life of a human being, there are 3 pieces of advice in terms of his relationship with Allah. As I mentioned, the first piece of advice, the first 3 about self-discipline, they all dealt with your diet. The second 3 about society was related to your akhlaq and controlling your anger. Over here, in terms of your relationship with Allah, all of these 3 pieces of advice were in relation to ilm and knowledge. The Imam says the first piece of advice is that when you don't know something, go and ask the experts. The Imams of Ahlul Bayt would say that the smartest individual, the most knowledgeable individual, is the one who adds the knowledge of others to his own knowledge. Then the Imam says the second piece of advice is that an individual takes precaution in his affair. Whenever he has a matter, he doesn't hasten towards it. He doesn't rush towards it. He ponders over it. He reflects over it. He takes advice from individuals. Then the final thing the Imam says is that my third and final advice towards you is that you run away from giving a fatwa. You run away from giving a religious ruling in the way you would run away from a lion. Because you do not want your neck to be a bridge for other people. Oftentimes when we go to the mosque, in one corner there is an ayatollah, in the other corner there is a mujtahid, in the other corner is a PhD, and another corner is an individual passing his rulings from over there. But you stop, you ask that individual that, do you even have knowledge about the subjects that you're speaking of? Imam al-Sadiq is saying that even if you have knowledge, run away from passing a ruling in the way that you would run away from a lion, and in that manner you would reach the status of being somebody who is an abd and a servant of Allah. So you find this is the advice of Imam Ja'far al-Sadiq. But when you look at the world, you find there were many people who were abid and there were many people who were worshippers. But there was only one individual who was known as Zainul Abidin, and the one who was the adornment of the worshippers. You see, what was the worship of Imam Zainul Abidin? It's stated that Imam Zainul Abidin, as he goes from Karbala towards Kufa, that even in such a state, when he's in shackles, he remembers Allah. But without a doubt, when it comes to the life of Imam Zainul Abidin, one of the most difficult moments was upon the 13th of Muharram, when he comes towards the land of Karbala. It's stated when Imam Zainul Abidin, he comes towards the land of Karbala, the tribe of Banu Asad had told Imam al-Hussein, we would bury the bodies of the companions. But at that moment, they didn't bury the bodies because they saw that the bodies were dismembered upon the ground. As they're looking at these bodies upon the plains of Karbala, it's stated from the direction of Kufa, Imam Zainul Abidin, he comes, and as he comes, he goes through all of the bodies until he falls upon one body at the ground, and he says, Assalamu alayka ya Aba Abdullah. After that, Imam Zainul Abidin, he would tell them how to bury the bodies. The tribe of Banu Asad, they made one grave for Habib ibn Madahir. Then the Imam says, make one grave for the companions. As they make that grave for the companions, it's stated that Banu Asad, they come to Imam Zainul Abidin and they say, oh man, there is a body by the Furat. When we pick one side of the body, the other side falls on the ground. And when we pick the other side of the body, the other side falls on the ground. Imam Zainul Abidin says, that is the body of my uncle Abbas. I will bury that body. After that, he says, oh Banu Asad, step back, for only I will bury my father. It's stated Imam Zainul Abidin, he places his abba and his cloak on the ground. He begins to collect the pieces of the body of his father. He begins to bury Sayyid al-Shuhada. As he's burying Sayyid al-Shuhada, the riwayah states that a voice comes from the cut body of Hussein, and that voice at that moment, it says, Tifli, Tifli, that where is my child? Imam Zainul Abidin says, oh Banu Asad, where is the body of the 6-month infant? They bring the body of Ali Asghar. They bury him upon the chest of Imam al-Hussein. They bury Ali Akbar by the feet of Imam al-Hussein. Imam Zainul Abidin writes on the grave, هذا قبر أبي عبد الله الذي قتل غريب وأتشانا. ألا لعنة الله على القوم الظالمين سيعلم الذين ظلموا أي منقلب ينقلبون. Ya Allah, we pray through the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, wherever the followers of Ahlul Bayt are in difficulty, help them. Wherever they're sick and ailing, cure them. Ya Allah, grant us the ziyarah of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad, and in the hereafter grant us the shafa'ah of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. And we pray for the reappearance of the 12th of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad. There is a request for dua. There's a sister by the name of Nadia Hussein who had recently gotten into a car accident, is in a very critical condition. Together, as the time of Maghrib approaches, as we're in a state of fasting, through the right of Imam Zainul Abidin, and all together we say Bismillahir Rahmanir Rahim. Amma yujibul أما يجيب أما يجيب أما Final time altogether. أما يجيب المضطر إذا دعاه ويكشف سوء. We ask through the right of Muhammad and Ali Muhammad that you cure this individual. ربنا تقبل منا إنك أنت السميع العليم. One Surah Al-Fatiha after your loudest salawat ala Muhammad wa Ali Muhammad.